Okay, thank you for that very nice introduction. Several months ago, I had a long talk with Jin Young and Chung Lee as they were planning the programs that would accompany the wonderful exhibition that's on view in the galleries, Trace of Life. And we discussed what kind of presentation I might make that would add something to the experience of the exhibition. Because I'm a curator at the International Center of Photography, which has a long tradition of specialized exhibitions about documentary photography and photojournalism, I think they expected me to say, why don't I talk about that photographic tradition and how recent Korean photography fits into that realist approach. I think they were a little surprised when I said perhaps it might be just as interesting, or maybe more interesting, if I showed some examples of very recent work from Korean photographers that are not so much in the realist tradition, but show the expansive scope of creative photography in Korea today. We talked back and forth about that idea for a while, and I think finally they came to see that perhaps that might be just as interesting as what they had expected me to propose. I'll say at the outset that I make no claims to being an expert about recent Korean photography. I have traveled quite a lot in Asia over the last decade. I have been to exhibitions many times in Japan, China, and Korea. I suppose that one of the reasons I was interested in presenting this kind of talk is that last December, thanks to a very wonderful invitation from the Ilwoo Foundation in Seoul, I had a chance to go to Seoul for a period of several days as part of a photo prize jury. And they had organized things so well that I was able to do half-hour sessions with about 24 Korean photographers in a matter of only a few days. It was very intense. I learned an enormous amount from the young artists and photographers that I talked to. And it really gave me a new appreciation and a new kind of understanding of the accomplishments of recent photographers in Korea. What I noticed especially is that many of the younger generation photographers, those who are under 30 years of age, all have a kind of common educational profile. They have all been educated at top art academies or universities in Korea, and then they choose to go for further study to some of the top art schools in Europe and North America. So I was very impressed at the enormous sophistication of these young Korean photographers. They sometimes knew much more than I did about what was going on currently in London or Paris or Berlin. And I felt that this gave their work really an extraordinary new kind of interest as they continue to make work that is certainly rooted in the realities of Korean life today, but also attuned in perhaps a new way to the main currents that you can find in the art world everywhere around the planet today. So with that introduction, I'd like to show some examples of work to you arranged more or less chronologically according to the generation of the photographers. The exhibition that's on view in the gallery, Trace of Life, concentrates on photography in the realist vein up until around the year 1992. And many of those photographers were born in the 1920s, 1930s, a much earlier generation. We'll start with a photographer born in the year 1950, that is 5 years after the end of the Second World War. His name is Bae Pyong-woo, and he's probably one of the best-known Korean photographers working anywhere in the world today. As I travel around in Europe and in Asia, I'm not surprised when I see an exhibition by Bae Pyong-woo wherever I go. Those of you who live in New York know that he showed at Ghana Gallery in Chelsea probably 2 years or 3 years ago, if my memory serves correctly. Here's the photographer, and you get a sense of this very determined fellow. He's a real photographer. He has been teaching photography at the Seoul Institute of the Arts since the early 1980s. Those of you who know his work are aware that his lifetime subject, his recurrent theme, his ongoing passion is to photograph the ancient pine forests in Korea. He does this in such a way, in both black and white and color, that you get a kind of rhythmic, musical sense of the beautiful curves of the tree trunks. You can see that he's a master of black and white tonality. These are like sophisticated musical compositions with visual counterpoint in every direction that you look. Here's what the photographer has to say about his approach and about why he feels that there's a strong aesthetic value to what he's doing. He writes, and I quote, "A pine grove or a landscape, nature in general, always exists in chaos. When a photographer triggers a camera at nature, he will automatically record an aspect of the chaos. Whether the photograph is deserving of the name of art is another question. Taking an artistic photograph would need an eye to decipher an artistic form in the middle of chaos." So that's the challenge, the test that Bae Pyong-woo poses for himself, and that's the game that he plays in his photographs over a number of decades now. Finding different moments of harmony, different kinds of harmony that can be isolated in a photographic frame in the midst of what anyone else standing in the same point might see as just an array of chaotic forms on all sides. Okay. Chung is the second photographer we will look at. Here he is. He has an interesting background. He majored in business administration before turning to photography and studying photography in Hamburg, in Germany. He has been active as a photographer for several decades now. Unlike Bae Pyong-woo, who has continued consistently with a single theme over many years, Chung works in discrete series of photographs, which may occupy him for a year or 2 years, and then he turns to something entirely different. For example, in the mid-1990s, he carried out a very impressive series of large-scale collage works, and you see an installation photograph here that should give you an idea about the really impressive scale of these works. The series is called In the Beginning, and he's concentrating on individual hands, individual feet, and then photographs of bodies seeming to emerge into life. You can see that he is making many exposures, making many prints, and then carefully overlaying them in a collage-like style and pinning them directly to the wall. These are very powerful images of the human form that convey a whole range of powerful emotions. In some of his more recent series, he has turned to photographing in the studio the very beautiful and sometimes very minimalistic forms of Korean housewares and ceramics from the past. Some of these are extremely simple shapes, black forms against very light backdrops that really emphasize the mass and solidity of these objects. He has also, in the last few years, carried out quite extensive series of photographs in which he poses models in costumes that he has selected wearing traditional Korean masks. And you can see how dramatic these are. At first you think they're tiny little models, and then slowly you realize these are life-size people. And here, if you look on the left of this installation shot, you can get a sense of the very impressive scale of these works. These are works, and I think this is true of almost everyone we'll be seeing this evening. These are works that are made for display in galleries or museums, not so much for the pages of magazines or even books. These are works that are meant to be seen and experienced one-to-one in a beautiful, well-lit gallery space. Okay. A photographer who has exhibited around the world in the last 10 years is Kim Otta. And here he is. Back in the year 2006 at ICP, we presented a solo exhibition of the work of Kim Otta. He is someone that I met back in 2001 when he took part in a group exhibition at the Queen's Museum. And at that time, as I remember when we met, his first question was, when will you give me an exhibition at ICP? And I said, we need to talk about that for a while before any decision is made. And he was very direct and said, I really want someday to have an exhibition in your museum. Every year for 5 years, he came to New York and we would meet and talk seriously about the work that he was doing. I was very impressed with his work from the beginning, but just wanted to make sure that we could work together. And eventually in 2006, we did organize what I thought was a really beautiful exhibition of his work from his recent On Air series. Those of you who know the work of Kim Otta know that he also works in series over the course of many years. In his case, his first very well-known series was called The Museum Project, and in it he set out to present a kind of personal image of Korean society and Korean life by posing models, by posing real people from many different parts of Korean society in plexiglass boxes. Sometimes he would pose models in boxes on streets late at night, as you see here. Sometimes working in the studio, he would set up little scenes to portray his vision of the current state of yuppie culture in Korea. Here you see two young people dressed Western style, holding Western eating utensils, and really going at it very enthusiastically, while paying no attention to those isolated figures in the plexiglass, the smaller plexi boxes off to the right. Otta Kim is he's a fellow who has long been fascinated by Eastern mystical traditions and Eastern philosophical traditions. He has said that he is not a practicing Buddhist, but Buddhist imagery is very much present in all of his works. He has a very long and fascinating story about how he won permission to photograph inside some well-known monasteries in Korea, and how he was able to convince the monks, male and female, to pose nude for him inside plexiglass boxes, as you see here. After completing the museum project, Otta Kim went on to another long-term project that he called On Air. And these photographs consisted of extremely long exposure times, 12 hours, 24 hours, even longer. The long exposure time means that all traces of human movement really disappeared. and presented a vision of cities and landscapes as if seen from some spirit's eye, watching the years and the decades and the centuries pass down below. This image is one of the group of photographs that Kim Otta made along the DMZ in Korea, separating South Korea from North Korea. He said that he set up his camera, his large camera, on a hilltop, pointed it out over the DMZ, and he said that he could see in the distance on the other side, guns turning to face him and people looking through binoculars, wondering what kind of bad intentions he might have with that mysterious thing that he was setting up. Again, from the on-air series, what looks like a totally abstract image, which is in fact 24-hour exposure of a block of ice melting, photographed in a studio so that you start to see the liquefaction of that solid, transparent block of ice under some high-intensity lights. Kim Otta describes his photographs almost dismissively as being merely byproducts of his attempt to fashion a personal philosophy woven together from many different strains of Eastern philosophy and mysticism. And he can talk in a very fascinating way about all that. Nevertheless, I continue to find his photographs powerful and mesmerizing on the basis of their purely visual qualities. And my curatorial interest in his work really has to do with the extraordinary images that he's able to create, and not so much the very elaborate speculative philosophy that he says leads him to create these images. One of the international rising stars of contemporary Korean art is Jung Yeon Doo. He was born in 1969. Here he is. And he too follows this pattern that I mentioned earlier. He initially studied in Seoul at the National University. He then moved to London and studied at both St. Martin's College of Art and Goldsmiths College of Art, two of the very top art academies anywhere in the world. I think it's because of that background that his work seems so sophisticated and so internationalized that as I look at it, I see in the course of his development a kind of dropping away of specific Korean references as he starts to address a real international art audience through his work. I remember back around 2001 in Shanghai seeing an exhibition of Jung Yeon Doo's, some of his very earliest photographic work. He did a series called Evergreen Tower, in which he photographed almost every residential apartment in a big towering high-rise. Each one of the apartments had the same physical dimensions, and so when you saw the photographs in a grid, at first you thought maybe that's the same dwelling just on different days, and then you looked more closely and you realized you were looking at quite a lot of different families who had decorated their apartments in extremely different ways, very idiosyncratic ways sometimes. And so even though the dimensions of the space were exactly duplicated from apartment to apartment, the sensation you got, the use of the space, the domestication of the space showed such a range of different personalities and different taste that you really got a strong sense of the incredible diversity of people in Korea. A later series called Locations really was moving away from realistic photography toward an exploration of the use of lighting and props to create something almost like narrative situations in many different locales around Korea. For example, here you see two young people dancing. It seems like they're on a rooftop, although I have a feeling that, that's probably a stage set. Okay, here it's a very interesting photograph of a young woman holding a bird cage with two small white birds on a deserted country road. The reason the photograph gives you such a feeling of an uncanny space is that even though you can't see it, off to the right, hidden in the trees, is a large floodlight which is being used to illuminate the young woman from the right-hand side. And that light color is just a little cooler. It's just a little different from the natural light color that you see in the rest of the scene. It gives you the feeling that she's somehow, again, on a theatrical set, being theatrically lit, but at the same time, you see very clearly that she's in a realistic rural space. And here, this is an installation photograph that gives you a sense of the size of Jung Yeon Doo's works and gives you a sense of the kind of very exuberant wall decoration that he likes to use as a backdrop for these hangings. Okay, I'm not sure you can read this writing, so I will read it in just 1 second. This is from a very interesting series by Jung Yeon Doo called Bewitched. And in it, he made double portraits of a number of young subjects. In each case, he photographed them first in their everyday life, in their work location or in their home apartment. He talked to them and he asked them, what's your fantasy about what you want to do before you get old? And he used the answers that he received in order to create the second portrait, often posed in a studio, often using very elaborate props. So I'll walk over to the screen and read this one to you just to give you a sense of the two different images of the same young woman. She's saying, I can always go to Europe when I'm old and rich. I'm saving money to travel somewhere I can only go when I'm young, somewhere extreme. I get really upset when people treat me like a naive, normal girl. I'm working very hard so I can pay for my trip and show them I'm different. Okay. So you see her in her everyday job up at the top, and then down below looking like a real heroic action movie figure with her harpoon and her dog sled out somewhere in the frozen parts of the Arctic, looking very determined and, as again, just really heroic and ready to surmount every obstacle. Okay, and I will read this one also. I think this is the other one I have. Okay, this is Jung Yeon Doo speaking. He says, we were at Tokyo Dome Museum when he first mentioned that he wanted to go to Afghanistan. The exhibition Treasures from Afghanistan displayed how important heritages had been destroyed. As an art lover himself, he couldn't stand the loss of such treasures and wanted to take action. So you see him as a teacher or as a businessman up at the top. It's unclear what kind of seminar group he's leading, wearing a suit and tie. And then down below in the second image, you see him in what looks like a very rough building, perhaps in Afghanistan, wearing his overalls and a bandana in front of a blackboard in which he seems to be teaching the history of Afghani art to a group of young Afghani men and women. So again, a kind of personal fantasy, a personal vision that Jung Yeon Doo managed to capture in this very interesting double portrait. And let's see, the last little item by Jung Yeon Doo I want to show you, he's a very prolific and productive artist, is a clip from a video that he made in 2010. And if we can go to that video clip, 6 points, it's a very elaborately made work. He and his assistants apparently spent a year at the computer combining many different still photographs and moving bits of image. What he did was to make many photographs in New York, in Queens, from a moving car. In the computer, he stitched them all together in such a way that he was able to create the illusion of a slowly panning camera moving down a street in Queens, and you can even see the shadows moving. It's just an enormously interesting technical accomplishment, which gives you a feeling of being in a three-dimensional space, but at the same time you experience those figures on the streets as almost cutouts. They seem like flat two-dimensional figures that have been added like a kind of collage to this scene. The work itself is usually presented as a large-scale, floor-to-ceiling video projection. You can walk right up to the screen and everything is totally sharp and detailed. It really creates a powerful alternate vision of reality, which becomes totally mesmerizing. Okay, now let's see if we can go back to the PDF and continue on to, let's see, and I will change it. Well, I won't say anything about that because we're running just a little far behind. Okay. Okay, the next photographer I'd like to talk about is a young man named Park Sung-woo. He was born in 1973. He again follows the international pattern that I mentioned earlier. He first studied at Chung University in Seoul and then went on to London to do graduate studies, an MFA at Middlesex University in London. I spent a lot of time with Park Sung-woo when he's been in New York over the years. He too has had a couple of shows at Ghana Art Gallery. He is also someone who thinks very hard about how to combine in his work motifs drawn from his life in Korea, but put through the perspective that he has acquired by traveling around the world and observing very carefully the artworks that he sees being made all around the planet. And he's the only one I couldn't find a portrait for. I apologize. One of his very first series of works that I saw, and this is back around 2001 and 2002, I think that's the first time he came to visit me at ICP. He did a series based on the architectural park on the edge of Seoul, where the most famous buildings in the world are recreated in miniature. And here you see the Twin Towers still existing, and strangely right next to the Chrysler Building. What I find interesting about these works is the way that whoever designed this architecture, this park of architectural monuments, felt a lot of freedom and a lot of liberty to rearrange different urban spaces from around the world, and that's really what gives it its charm. So that here you see on the left, you recognize our familiar Empire State Building from New York, and then off to the right you see the two twin towers designed by Cesar Paley that are the leading architectural monument in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Okay, and suddenly we're in the harbor in Sydney, and even the pyramids. Okay. So I can hear the laughter, and I know that you're all getting the humor and the exactly the kind of discrepancy that Pak Sung-woo was trying to point out with these very deadpan, very low-key photographs, which show on the one hand the Korean fascination with the great architectural constructions from past and present everywhere in the world, and also the very incongruous site where in Seoul these buildings appear. In 2002, Pak Sung-woo visited North Korea for the first time, and he spent about a week in Pyongyang. He said he spent most of his time in a hotel because he was being watched so closely that he really couldn't wander around on his own. He made a number of photographs from his hotel window and also in the course of some of the official events that he was allowed to attend and when he was allowed to photograph. And later he put together an installation of individual images that he called blow up. And as you start to look carefully at these images, you realize that the point he's trying to make was just how carefully ordered and stage managed everything that he saw while he was in Pyongyang happened to be. He reported looking out his hotel window, seeing seemingly prosperous shoppers out with bags walking around on the streets. But he said if you looked back 20 minutes later, you saw the same shoppers making the circuit, and they were doing it over and over and over again, for the benefit of the foreign tourist in that hotel. So blow up, of course, refers back to that famous Antonioni film of the 1960s, which is also about the gap between what the camera records and the actual events that are taking place out there in the world. As an outgrowth of that trip to Pyongyang, Pak Sung-woo was able to purchase some photographic propaganda books from the older years in North Korea. And he made a very interesting series of large-scale photographic works by scanning those images showing the post-war reconstruction in North Korea, and then adding his own tints and hand coloring to add a kind of distancing motif, showing that these images of urban renewal and great industrial achievements might have been a little more stage managed and stage crafted than the photographs themselves might originally appear. Now, you've undoubtedly been wondering, where are the women photographers? Okay, here they're coming now. One of the photographers that I met when I was in Seoul last December was a young woman named Hyun Doo. And I was fascinated with her work because of the very unusual, the extraordinary technique that she has devised to sort of bring together her dual interest in painting and in photography. She was born in 1964, did her undergraduate work at the Seoul National University, and then did graduate work at New York University. What she has been doing for the last 4 or 5 years is building elaborate sets, studio sets, and filling them with objects that she then elaborately hand paints. And then she makes a large-scale photograph of the scene that she has created. The resulting image very often is indistinguishable from a photograph of a painting. I mean, there's really no way, looking at this slide or even looking at a printed reproduction, no way that you can tell if you're looking at a reproduction of a painting or, as is in fact the case, at a photograph of a hand-painted scene. She clearly has studied her 20th century art history. You can find references, very subtle references to works of painters like Edward Hopper, to many of the French surrealist painters of the 1920s and 30s like Salvador Dali. In some cases, she goes to quite elaborate lengths to create on these stage sets improbable illusions of objects floating in midair. She's got a very good website if you're at all interested, with lots of production stills showing her at work, showing how she manages to have these objects seemingly floating in the air. Here you can see her with her assistants, and you get a sense of this stage-like set where she is assembling a number of painted globes, and you can see that painted backdrop behind them. And this is the finished work, which gives you a sense of being sort of lost in space with dozens of miniature Earth-like planets, all waiting for someone to set them in motion. This gives you a sense of the enormous scale of Hyun Doo's finished prints. And I want to call your special attention to the large-scale photograph on the right, which is titled Bleeding Blue. Let's see if we've got a... Okay, yeah, here is a close-up of that work. Which shows a young man seated on a couch. You can see that all of those surroundings have been heavily painted over. His face has been heavily painted over. It's really almost impossible to tell, looking at this image, if it's a painting or something else. I thought it might be interesting for you if we go to the next video clip. There's a very interesting little film that was made at the same time as the photograph, filmed by Hyun Doo. Bleeding Blue, it's called. Since it's about 10 minutes long, we'll only look at a very short segment of it that shows you in fast motion how she's painting over the many objects here. And in just a moment, I think we should see the young man seated on the couch, and we will see paint being applied to his face. For anyone who's interested, yeah, here is the artist, applying makeup and paint. You can see the assistants in the background adding all that, and so it's the film itself is both a kind of document of the production of the photograph, but it has its own sort of fantasy-like narrative about a young man who comes home to his apartment and is sort of kidnapped by a team of artists and doesn't really know quite what to do. But he goes along for the ride and ends up as part of an artwork. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Now, the last photographer we will look at this evening is a young woman named Lee Eun-jung. I also met her when I did my marathon set of portfolio reviews in Seoul in December. And here she is in the center. She is a very lively and self-confident young woman, as you can probably get a sense here. She was born in 1970, studied fashion design as an undergraduate, and then took up photography for her MFA program. She has been exhibiting around the world for the last 5 years with solo shows in Australia, France, Germany, Japan, and far-flung places like Lithuania and Slovakia. I'll give you a little sense of the development of her work, which also sort of follows this trajectory that we've seen earlier from more or less straightforward, almost documentary style images of interiors to something much more elaborate. These early works from around 2001, 2002 by Hyun Joong show domestic interiors, the sleeping spaces of various friends and acquaintances whom she knew, who allowed her to come in and make these very intimate pictures of their very casual living situations. Her next series was a little more dramatic. She spent several years photographing in, I guess, the Korean version of Japanese love hotels, where young men and women might want to go for perhaps a night or maybe even just an hour or two. And these photographs give a sense of the very theatricalized boudoir scenes that greet the customers of these places. And this was a very big series, and I think it's probably been exhibited more than any of her other works. It seems to evoke a lot of fascination outside of Korea. Okay, here you get a sense of the scale of those prints, and there you see the artist, posing in her artist gear in front of them. Since 2004, she's been working on what I think is a really interesting series of photographs of artist studios all around the world. What she has done is to first find artists whose work she finds interesting. She gets to know them well enough to win their confidence, and then ask them if they will allow her to spend a day or 2 days in their studio and rearrange everything that's in there in the way that she wants to make the kind of photograph that she wants. She has written that she feels that the materials found in every artist studio give a clue to that artist's inner life and imagination. And she feels that she's really there to help bring that sense to a greater degree of visibility by actively placing and rearranging every object in there. So as messy as it may look, there is actually a kind of secret logic or secret order at work in the images in this series. Some of the artist studios are quite large, and I can't imagine how much work must have gone into staging this particular image. Okay, or this one. Okay, and this one. Okay, these are also shown as very large-scale prints. Probably about 1.5 meters by 2 meters, something like that. Very large-scale prints. Now, currently, Hyun Joong is working on a major project, which sounded a little unbelievable to me when she described it to me, called Over and Under. Somehow, I think because she's so persistent and won't take no for an answer, she has won permission from several construction companies and building authorities in Seoul to take her camera to underground construction sites while the work is in progress and to make photographs after the workers have gone home for the day. She typically works with the lighting situations that she finds, but once again, she's approaching these construction scenes as if they're almost left there by artists, as if they are the scenes of some kind of bizarre installation art in process. And she has just started exhibiting these. I found this installation shot on the web today, just to give you a sense of the scale of these works and their increasing number. I really haven't seen the full set, and I'm hoping that when I'm in Seoul again in December, I'll be able to get a sense of how this very elaborate and very ambitious project is coming along. Now, that really brings me to the end of the group of photographers that I wanted to show to you this evening. And I hope that through this presentation, you're able to get a little sense of the extraordinary scope and also the diversity of contemporary photography in Korea. Certainly the realist photography tradition in Korea continues to be very strong, as it is in every country where there are enormous social and economic changes taking place. But I think you should also be able to see that there has been a real flowering in creative photography in Korea, and that it is producing some artists who are very easily able to take a place among their peers on the international art stage. So that brings me to the end of my remarks. I want to thank you for your attention, but before we close tonight, I want to see what kinds of comments or questions you might have that perhaps I can answer or perhaps someone else in the audience can answer. I know that there are a few people here this evening who know much more about Korean contemporary photography than I do, and it might be interesting to have some observations from them.
Please wait for the microphone.
Yes, Marek Stempy, I am a Korea Society member. My fascination about Korean culture and art came through the Korean movies, which I was completely taken up by. And I think Korea makes currently probably the best cinematography in the world. But your lecture and this exhibit also pointed to me that Korean photography is strongly coming up. Now, I have my own take on why this artistic emergence happens in Korea.
I'd love to hear it.
Yes, that has to do with a certain, as I have learned about Korean culture in the past 3 years, Korean culture has built in a lot of tension through a lot of opposites. Koreans are very expressive on one hand. On the other hand, they are confined by the Confucian tradition. There is North and South split too. And there is this enormously rapid change taking place in Korea. In one generation, from the poorest country in the world, they became one of the top 10. So, and I think this would be a case also in Japan, in China to some extent, that the new media is a little more embraced by the artists than the traditional forms of expression because of that Confucian tradition. And traditionally, the Far Eastern art was very confined, subject-wise and style-wise. So I would like you to comment on that.
I think you have said it very clearly and very succinctly that in almost every country where you see such a rapid economic and social transition, and we've seen that since 1945 in Japan, Korea, and China, if it provides a very rich source of material for creative people, whether they are writers or image makers or filmmakers. There's just such rich subject matter and such provocative juxtapositions of sites and events all around that it provides a fabulous starting point.
How I detect your fascination with specifically Korean photography, but how you would compare it and place it in the Far Eastern setting?
That's a really big question, and I think about it a lot, but I don't have a very short and succinct answer. It would be too glib. All I can say is that the more I learn about Japanese, Korean, and Chinese cultures, the more clearly the very strong differences come through. I mean, it's almost like different planets.
Yes, but you wouldn't.
I'm not going to start to speculate on all because they're all of those photographic traditions are so nuanced and so diverse that the generalizations are not really helpful until you understand sort of what you're talking about.
Can you closer to the microphone?
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments?
Thank you very much. A wonderful presentation. I'm curious about something. I don't remember the photographer's name. I'm sorry, but the one who did the portrait of the Buddhist altar with the monks and the nuns posing nude. I was just curious, since Korea is, from what I understand, about half Buddhist, did that generate any controversy among the Buddhist population of South Korea?
If you're interested in hearing the entire story, I'll refer you to the catalog that we did at
Thank you.
ICP in 2006, in which Kim Otta talks at enormous length about how for 2 years he had to pay regular visits to the chief monk at this monastery and convince him of his sincerity, convince him that he was not trying to do anything scandalous, but really was trying to obtain a kind of unusual view into the human soul. And with the permission of the abbot, he then was able to start conversations with individual monks and essentially ask for volunteers who felt comfortable and were willing to pose nude for him. He was Kim Otta was very aware of the potential for scandal in terms of this work, and he, as I say, he went through years of preparations and made sure that everyone knew what he was doing and knew what his motivation was. So I have not heard of any outburst or demonstrations or lawsuits or anything like that.
Thank you.
Oh, and just as a footnote to that, I'll mention that the only negative or unexpected reaction to that group of photographs came when they were shown in New York, and there was one photograph that included a very young, beautiful nude boy with a group of nude male and female monks, and our lawyer at ICP said, I hope we have a signed permission from the parents of that young man, or there could be like kiddie porn proceedings brought against us. I mean, it was like the most innocent and beautiful picture in the world, but that's so it's impossible to predict all of the crazy reactions that you may get. Okay, other questions or comments?
I noticed that a lot of the people that they all have generally very large prints, and the gallery is very important.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that, is the book at all important in the way that it is in, say, Japan or here, where putting the work into a book becomes very important? Is that that kind of thing?
Yes.
Not as...
and what I was very interested to discover when I was in Seoul last December, and as I say, I saw about 24 photographers in a very short period of time. Almost all of them had printed catalogs, some quite elaborate, but they are monolingual, all in Korean, and they don't really circulate outside Korea. So if you're interested in starting to look at what seems to be an enormous photographic publishing program among younger and mid-career photographers, you've got to go to Korea or have a friend there who will scout around to the galleries and the museums and the bookstores and start to obtain them. The publications that I saw were beautifully designed, beautifully printed, but almost all of them, the text were exclusively in Korean. Okay. Is there one more comment, and then we will make it more casual. Okay.
How these projects are funded? I know that in Europe there is a lot of governmental involvement, and I know that there is some governmental involvement in the Korean movie industry. So I suspect there is some financing from those sources.
The Korean Cultural Ministry provides very generous grants for artists of all kinds. There are, in the last 8 or 10 years, a number of very generous cultural foundations have sprung up in Korea, and they also offer scholarships, awards that provide the ability to make large-scale exhibition prints or a catalog. So for example, the Ilwoo Foundation every year has judging, and judges are invited in from 2 or 3 different countries to look at the works of younger Korean photographers. And at the end of the judging, one young photographer receives an exhibition and the funding to make the prints, and another receives funding to publish a book of their work.
So good channels get involved with that? The large Korean corporations, do they get involved?
I think increasingly the corporations are becoming involved in supporting cultural activities. It very often depends on the personal interests of the leaders of the corporation and their families. And that's the situation with Ilwoo, which has the backing of Korea Airlines. Okay. Thank you for those great questions and comments. Anyone who would like to talk more casually, now that this is formally over, I'm happy to stay and talk as long as you are interested. So thank you very much for coming out this evening. I enjoyed it.
Our gallery will still continuously open, so please enjoy the gallery, and then catalog will be out there displayed, so please enjoy those publications for purchase.